in the vibrant coastal town of Coral Bay, where the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and seaweed, a man named Diego Morales was wrongfully arrested by two prejudiced police officers, Bennett and Torres. But when Diego's true identity was revealed, the entire police station was left speechless. What happened? And who was Diego Morales that turned a routine arrest into a monumental reckoning? Let's find out. Before we dive in, comment below where you're reading from today. And if you love this story, don't forget to share it. It was a typical morning in Coral Bay, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows across the vibrant boardwalk lined with colorful shops, quaint cafes, and bustling market stalls. The air buzzed with the sounds of crashing waves, the distant cry of seagulls, and the lively chatter of locals and tourists alike. The boardwalk was a kaleidoscope of activity. Joggers weaved through the early morning crowd, vendors arranged fresh produce and handmade crafts under striped awnings, and families strolled leisurely, savoring the salty breeze and the promise of a warm day ahead. The scent of roasted coffee beans mingled with the tang of the sea, creating a sensory tapestry that was uniquely Coral Bay. Among the throng, Diego Morales walked with a steady, purposeful stride, a stark contrast to the hurried pace around him. In his mid-30s, Diego was dressed in a meticulously tailored charcoal suit, the fabric catching the morning light with a subtle sheen. His polished Oxford shoes clicked rhythmically against the cobblestone path, and a crisp blue shirt peeked out from beneath his jacket, its cuffs adjusted with practiced precision. A warm smile played on his lips as he nodded to familiar faces. A vendor arranging flowers, a barista waving from a cafe window. His presence commanded attention, not because he sought it, but because of the quiet confidence he exuded, an aura of authority tempered by genuine warmth. Diego had just finished breakfast at the Coral Cafe, a beloved local spot tucked between a bookstore and a surf shop, its weathered wooden sign swaying gently in the breeze. The cafe was a haven of familiarity, where the staff knew him by name and greeted him like family. Inside, the walls were adorned with faded photographs of Coral Bay's history, black and white images of fishermen, old piers, and the town's first lighthouse. The aroma of fresh-baked pastries and brewing coffee filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of conversation. Diego's usual order, scrambled eggs with a hint of rosemary, smoked salmon draped over toasted sourdough, and a side of fresh mango slices, was prepared with care by Clara, the cafe's veteran cook. "Looking sharp as always, Diego," Clara had said with a grin, sliding the plate across the counter. Diego chuckled, his dark eyes crinkling at the corners. "You say that every morning, Clara." "And I mean it every morning," she shot back, her hands on her hips. Their banter was a ritual, a small moment of connection that grounded Diego in the community he cherished. As he left the cafe, Diego savored the last sip of his coffee, the bitter warmth lingering on his tongue. He stepped onto the boardwalk, the morning sun now climbing higher, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he pulled it out to see a message from his mother, Elena Morales, a woman whose strength and warmth had shaped him. "Don't forget dinner tonight, mijo. Bring that flan you make so well." Diego smiled, his heart swelling at the thought of his family gathered around the table, their laughter filling the small dining room of his childhood home. He typed a quick reply. "Wouldn't miss it, mama. Flan's on me." Family was his anchor, the bedrock of his life, and these small moments, texts from his mother, plans for dinner, kept him grounded amidst the demands of his work. Diego approached his car, a sleek navy coupe parked near the boardwalk's edge, its curves gleaming under the morning light. The car was a point of pride, a symbol of his hard-earned success, but it also drew attention, sometimes the wrong kind. As he reached for his keys, he noticed two police officers approaching from across the boardwalk. Their eyes were fixed on him, their expressions hard and unreadable, their steps deliberate. Diego didn't recognize them, which wasn't unusual. Coral Bay's police force often rotated new officers to patrol the tourist-heavy areas. But the intensity of their gaze set him on edge, a prickle of unease running down his spine. Diego, a Hispanic man, had grown up navigating the subtle and not-so-subtle biases that came with his identity. His father, a retired schoolteacher, had drilled into him the importance of composure in such moments. Stay calm, Miko. Be respectful. Never give them a reason to escalate. Those lessons had served him well, but they didn't erase the knot of apprehension that formed now. "Excuse me, sir," one officer called out, his voice sharp and clipped, cutting through the morning's hum. Diego stopped, turning to face them, his phone still in hand, the screen glowing with his mother's message. "Yes, officer?" he replied, his tone steady and polite, though his senses sharpened. The officer's badge read Bennett, his name etched in stark silver against the dark uniform. The other, Torres, stood slightly behind, his hand resting near his holster, his posture tense. Their uniforms were crisp, their faces set in a way that suggested this wasn't a casual check. "Can I see some ID?" Bennett asked, his tone demanding, offering no explanation. Diego had been through this before. Random stops, vague justifications. But something about this encounter felt different, charged with an unspoken tension that made his instincts flare. "May I ask why?" Diego responded, keeping his voice calm and measured. He knew his rights, had studied them meticulously, but he also knew the importance of de-escalation. Confrontation rarely ended well in these moments. Bennett's eyes narrowed, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if Diego's question was an affront. "Just show us your ID, sir. It's a simple request." The smirk carried a challenge, a dare to push back. Diego held Bennett's gaze for a moment, assessing the situation. The boardwalk was busy, people passing by, but few seemed to notice the exchange. He could feel Torres's eyes on him, the officer's hand still hovering near his holster, a silent warning. Diego's father's voice echoed again. "Be smart." Slowly, he reached into his jacket pocket, his movements deliberate to avoid any misinterpretation. "All right," he said, pulling out his wallet. "But I'd still like to know why I'm being asked." He handed over his driver's license, the plastic card catching the sunlight as it passed from his hand to Bennett's. Bennett took the ID, scanning it with a practiced indifference, his eyes flicking between the card and Diego's face. "What are you doing in this area?" he asked, his tone accusatory, as if Diego's presence on the boardwalk was inherently suspicious. "I'm just heading to my car," Diego answered, gesturing to the Navy coupe a few steps away. "Is there a problem?" His voice remained even, but a flicker of frustration stirred within him. He'd done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being questioned like a suspect. Bennett ignored the question, his focus still on the ID. "Where are you coming from?" "I had breakfast at the Coral Cafe," Diego replied, his patience wearing thin but his composure intact. The cafe was just across the boardwalk, its sign visible from where they stood. "Like I said, is there a problem, officer?" He kept his tone respectful, but the repetition of the question was deliberate, a gentle push for clarity. Bennett's eyes flicked up, a glint of annoyance crossing his face. "We've had reports of suspicious activity around here," he said, his voice flat, the words sounding rehearsed. "You match the description of someone we're looking for." Diego's stomach tightened, a familiar weight settling in his chest. He knew this narrative all too well. A Hispanic man in a nice suit, driving a nice car in a tourist-heavy area, must be up to no good. It was a script he'd encountered before, one that rarely ended with an apology. "I see," Diego said carefully, choosing his words with precision. "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding. I'm just heading to work." He kept his hands visible, his posture relaxed, but his mind was racing, cataloging every detail. The officers' expressions, their body language, the growing number of onlookers pausing to watch. Bennett's smirk returned, a subtle curl of his lip that spoke volumes. "Work? What kind of work do you do?" The question was laced with skepticism, as if Diego's claim was inherently dubious. "I'm a lawyer," Diego replied, his voice steady, though he could feel the tension building. "I have a meeting in an hour, so if there's nothing else, I'd like to be on my way." The mention of his profession seemed to catch Bennett off guard, his smirk faltering briefly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a harder edge. "A lawyer, huh?" Torres, who had been silent until now, spoke up, his voice dripping with doubt. "You sure you're not hiding anything? Got anything illegal in that car?" The question was provocative, a bait to elicit a reaction, and Diego recognized it for what it was. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. "There's nothing illegal in my car," he said firmly, his eyes locking with Torres's. "You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer you didn't waste your time. I'm just trying to get to work." His words were calm, but there was an undercurrent of steel, a refusal to be intimidated. Bennett's expression darkened, his patience evidently thinning. "You don't get to decide how we do our job," he snapped. "Step away from the car." Diego hesitated, his mind racing through his options. He hadn't done anything wrong, but he knew how quickly these situations could spiral. The boardwalk was crowded, but the onlookers were keeping their distance, unsure whether to intervene. His father's voice echoed once more. "Stay calm. Be smart." "All right," Diego said, raising his hand slightly to show he wasn't a threat. He stepped back from the coupe, his movements slow and deliberate. Without warning, Bennett lunged forward, grabbing Diego's arm and twisting it behind his back with a force that sent a jolt of pain through his shoulder. Diego winced, the suddenness catching him off guard, but he fought to keep his voice steady. "Hey, what are you doing?" he protested, his tone strained but controlled. Before he could say more, Torres was on him, his hands rough as he forced Diego to the ground, the cobblestones cold and hard against his knees. "I'm not resisting," Diego said, louder now, his voice carrying over the growing murmurs of the crowd. The pain in his arm intensified as Bennett snapped handcuffs around his wrists, the metal biting into his skin. "You're under arrest for resisting arrest," Bennett said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion, as if the accusation was a foregone conclusion. Diego's mind reeled. Resisting arrest? He hadn't resisted. He'd complied with every request, answered their questions, kept his hands visible. But it didn't matter. They'd decided his guilt the moment they saw him, their biases shaping the narrative before he'd even opened his mouth. The injustice burned, but Diego forced himself to stay calm, to focus on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him, it was about a system that allowed this to happen, that emboldened officers like Bennett and Torres to act with impunity. The commotion drew attention, the boardwalk's usual bustle giving way to a growing circle of onlookers. An elderly woman, Mrs. Rosa Hernandez, who ran a nearby souvenir shop, stepped out from her storefront, her eyes wide with horror. She knew Diego from his frequent visits to the Coral Cafe, where he'd often stopped to chat, his easy smile brightening her day. "What are you doing to him?" she called out, her voice trembling with outrage, her hands clutching the hem of her apron. "He didn't do anything wrong. Diego's a good man." A young couple, Javier and Sofia, pushing a stroller along the boardwalk, stopped to watch, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. Javier, a local mechanic with a quiet demeanor, pulled out his phone and started recording, his hand steady despite the anger in his eyes. "This is messed up," he muttered to Sofia, who clutched their toddler's stroller tightly. "They're arresting him for nothing." Sofia nodded, her voice low but firm. "Keep recording, Javi. People need to see this." Diego caught sight of the phone, its lens glinting in the sunlight, and a glimmer of hope flickered within him. The footage could be his lifeline, a way to prove what really happened, to hold these officers accountable. For now, though, he was powerless, his hands cuffed, his body pressed against the squad car as Bennett and Torres prepared to take him away. The crowd grew, more people stopping to watch, their voices rising in a chorus of disapproval. "This isn't right," a woman shouted, her voice sharp with indignation. "He didn't do anything. Let him go." Another man, a street musician with a guitar slung over his shoulder, stepped closer, his face a mask of anger. "You can't just arrest someone for no reason. This is Coral Bay, not a police state." The officers ignored the protests, their focus on Diego as they yanked him to his feet, their grip rough and unyielding. Bennett shoved him toward the squad car, parked just off the boardwalk, its lights flashing silently. Diego stumbled slightly, the cuffs restricting his movement, but he regained his balance, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him falter. As they pushed him into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a heavy thud, Diego turned to the crowd, his voice carrying through the open window, clear and resolute despite the circumstances. "This isn't over," he said loudly, his eyes meeting those of the onlookers, some of whom nodded in solidarity. "This isn't over." The words hung in the air, a promise, a defiance, as the squad car pulled away, its tires crunching against the gravel. The crowd watched in stunned silence, their anger simmering, some pulling out phones to share the video, others murmuring plans to organize, to demand answers. Diego's words echoed in their minds, a rallying cry that would not be easily forgotten. Inside the squad car, Diego sat in silence, the cuffs digging into his wrists, the hum of the engine a steady backdrop to his racing thoughts. He stared out the window, watching the boardwalk recede, the colorful shops and faces blurring into a kaleidoscope of motion. Bennett and Torres sat in the front, their conversation low and clipped, their words inaudible but their tension palpable. Diego's mind churned, piecing together the events, searching for a reason behind the arrest. He hadn't done anything to warrant this, which meant it was personal, or worse, systemic. He thought of his work, the cases he'd taken on, the powerful figures he'd challenged. Could this be connected? The thought sent a chill through him, but he pushed it aside, focusing on what he could control. He'd been in tough spots before, and he'd always found a way through. This would be no different. He just needed to stay sharp, to wait for his moment. The Coral Bay police station was a stark contrast to the vibrant boardwalk, its gray concrete walls and harsh fluorescent lights creating a cold, utilitarian atmosphere. The air smelled of stale coffee and disinfectant, the hum of activity punctuated by the clatter of keyboards and the occasional ring of a phone. Officers moved through the halls with purpose, some joking in low tones, others focused on paperwork, but an undercurrent of tension hung over the station, as if everyone sensed trouble brewing. Diego was led through the front doors, his hands still cuffed, with Bennett and Torres flanking him like sentinels. Their expressions were unreadable, their steps measured, but Diego could feel their unease, a subtle shift in their demeanor now that they were back on their turf. The booking area was a hive of activity, officers processing paperwork, suspects sitting in plastic chairs, their faces a mix of resignation and defiance. A few officers glanced up as Diego passed, their eyes lingering on his polished suit and calm demeanor, an anomaly among the usual suspects. "Over here," Bennett barked, steering Diego toward a desk where a tired officer sat behind a computer, his eyes bleary from a long shift. "Name?" the officer asked, his fingers poised over the keyboard, his voice flat. "Diego Morales," Bennett replied. Before Diego could speak, his tone clipped. The officer typed the name, his brow furrowing slightly as he scanned the screen, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He said nothing, though, merely gesturing for Bennett to take Diego to the fingerprinting station. "Let's get this over with," Bennett muttered, pushing Diego forward with a hand on his shoulder. Diego didn't resist, knowing better than to give them an excuse to escalate. The fingerprinting station was a small alcove, its walls lined with faded posters about police procedure. A technician, a middle-aged woman with a no-nonsense demeanor, took Diego's prints with mechanical efficiency, her eyes flicking to his suit, but offering no comment. Diego remained silent, his mind racing as he cataloged every detail: the officers' names, the layout of the station, the faces of those watching. He couldn't believe this was happening, but he knew he had to stay calm, to think clearly. This wasn't his first encounter with bias, and it likely wouldn't be the last. Once fingerprinting was complete, Bennett and Torres led Diego down a narrow hallway to a small holding cell, its metal door creaking as it opened. The cell was cramped, with a narrow bench bolted to the wall, a metal toilet in the corner, and the sour smell of disinfectant hanging heavy in the air. The walls were scratched with graffiti, faded names and dates etched into the paint, a testament to those who'd been here before. Bennett uncuffed Diego, his movements rough, and shoved him inside. "Make yourself comfortable," Torres sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You might be here a while." Diego sat on the bench, taking a deep breath to steady himself. He refused to respond to their taunts. There was no point. They wanted a reaction, a spark to justify their actions, but he wouldn't give them the satisfaction. As Bennett and Torres walked away, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, they exchanged a glance, a silent understanding passing between them. They'd done their job, brought in another troublemaker. But something about Diego's calmness nagged at Bennett, a nagging doubt he couldn't shake. He couldn't put his finger on it, but it didn't fit the usual profile. "Think he's really a lawyer?" Torres scoffed as they reached the front desk, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "Yeah," Bennett muttered, his mind elsewhere, his eyes scanning the booking area as if expecting trouble. "Maybe, but it doesn't matter. We followed orders." His voice lacked conviction, though, and Torres raised an eyebrow, sensing the uncertainty. Before they could continue, a young officer, Officer Carla Vega, approached, her expression cautious but determined. New to the department, Vega was eager to prove herself, but she was also sharp, with an instinct for when something was off. She'd been quietly observing the booking process, noting Diego's composure and the officer's aggression. "Hey, Bennett, can I talk to you for a second?" she asked, her voice low to avoid drawing attention. Bennett frowned, irritated by the interruption. "What is it, Vega?" he snapped, crossing his arms. She glanced around, ensuring no one was listening, then leaned in closer. "That guy you brought in, Diego Morales. I think I know who he is." "What are you talking about?" Bennett asked, his tone sharp, though a flicker of unease crossed his face. "I saw him in a news article a few weeks ago," Vega said, lowering her voice further. "He's not just a lawyer. He's a civil rights attorney, a big deal. He's been involved in high-profile cases against government corruption, taking on some powerful people. If he's who I think he is, this could blow up in our faces." Bennett's eyes widened, but he quickly masked his surprise, forcing a dismissive wave. "You sure?" he asked, his voice betraying a hint of doubt. "Positive," Vega replied, her tone firm. "You might want to be careful. If he's who I think he is, this could be trouble." Bennett's jaw tightened, but he brushed her off, turning back to the desk. "We followed procedure," he muttered, more to himself than to Vega. He was resisting. But the words sounded hollow, even to him, and Vega's warning lingered, a seed of doubt taking root. Vega watched Bennett for a moment, then pulled out her phone, scrolling to a contact. She hesitated, knowing the risk of going over her colleagues' heads, but her instincts told her this was too big to ignore. Taking a deep breath, she dialed. "Captain, it's Vega," she said quietly, stepping into a corner of the booking area to avoid being overheard. "We have a situation at the station. You need to know about it." In the holding cell, Diego sat quietly, his thoughts focused, his body still, but his mind racing. He knew this wasn't just about him, it was bigger, a symptom of a system that targeted people like him, that saw his identity as a threat. He'd been targeted, though the reason wasn't clear yet. Was it random, or was it connected to his work? The thought gnawed at him, but he refused to let fear take over. He'd faced worse. Courtrooms filled with hostile faces, threats from powerful adversaries, and he'd always found a way through. This would be no different. He just needed to stay sharp, to wait for his moment. An hour later, the holding area door swung open with a heavy clang, and a woman stepped inside. Captain Elena Navarro, in her late 30s, exuded authority, her sharp eyes scanning the room with a precision that missed nothing. New to Coral Bay, she'd already made it clear she wasn't to be underestimated, her reputation for fairness and toughness preceding her. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, her uniform impeccable, and her presence commanded the attention of every officer in the vicinity. Her gaze landed on Bennett and Torres, who were talking quietly at the front desk, their heads bent together in a way that suggested secrecy. Something about their demeanor caught her attention, a subtle shift that set her instincts on edge. "Bennett, Torres," she called, her voice firm but calm, cutting through the station's hum. The officers stiffened, turning to face her, their expressions carefully neutral. "What's going on here?" she asked, her tone probing, her eyes narrowing as she studied their faces. Bennett cleared his throat, his posture rigid. "Nothing much, ma'am. Just another arrest." His voice was steady, but there was a slight hesitation, a crack in his usual confidence. Navarro raised an eyebrow, her gaze unwavering. "What's the charge?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Resisting arrest," Bennett replied, his tone clipped. "We had reports of suspicious activity. He matched the description." Navarro's eyebrow lifted higher, a silent challenge. Did he now? She studied Bennett's face, searching for signs of deceit. She'd dealt with officers like him before, those who bent the rules to suit their biases, who relied on vague justifications to cover their tracks. "Take me to him," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. As they reached Diego's cell, Navarro paused, observing him through the small window in the door. He sat on the bench, hands folded, posture relaxed despite the cuff's absence, his suit still pristine despite the rough treatment. There was something about him, calm, composed, almost regal, that made her instincts flare. This wasn't a typical suspect, and she knew it. "This is him?" she asked, turning to Bennett. "Yes, ma'am," Bennett confirmed, his voice steady but his eyes darting to Torres, a silent plea for backup. He resisted, so we had no choice. Navarro's lips pressed into a thin line, her skepticism clear. She opened the cell door and stepped inside, her boots echoing against the concrete floor. "Mr. Morales, I'm Captain Elena Navarro," she said, her voice calm but authoritative. "I'd like to hear your side of the story." Diego looked up, meeting her gaze with steady, unflinching eyes. "Captain, I did no such thing," he said, his voice firm but respectful. "I complied with every instruction from Officers Bennett and Torres. I was walking to my car after breakfast when they stopped me. I asked why, and that seemed to escalate things. Before I knew it, I was cuffed and accused of resisting, despite following their orders." His words were measured, each one chosen with care, and Navarro listened intently, noting the clarity in his tone, the absence of fear or desperation. He wasn't just trying to talk his way out, he was composed, deliberate, a man who knew his worth and his rights. She turned to Bennett, who stood just outside the cell, his expression neutral, but his hands clenched at his sides. "Is that true?" she asked, her voice sharp. Did he comply? Bennett shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the floor before meeting hers. "Well, ma'am, he questioned us, and things got tense," he said, his voice faltering slightly. "We had reason to believe he was hiding something." Navarro's gaze hardened, her patience thinning. "And what was that reason?" she pressed, stepping closer to Bennett, her presence imposing. Bennett hesitated, his mind scrambling for a response. "It was just a gut feeling, ma'am," he admitted finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Navarro's expression darkened, her disbelief palpable. "A gut feeling," she repeated, her tone incredulous, each word dripping with disdain. "Is that the basis for your arrest?" Before Bennett could respond, the holding area door opened again, and Officer Vega entered, her face tense with urgency. "Captain, I need to speak with you," she said, glancing between Diego and Bennett, her eyes wide with concern. Navarro stepped out, closing the cell door with a soft click. "What is it, Vega?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Vega handed Navarro her phone, a web page already open, the screen glowing with text and images. "Ma'am, Diego Morales isn't just any lawyer," she said, her words rushed but clear. "He's a prominent civil rights attorney. He's been involved in major cases against government corruption, high-profile stuff, taking on agencies and officials. If word gets out we arrested him without cause, it's going to be a disaster." Navarro scanned the page, her eyes widening as she read. Diego wasn't just a lawyer, he was a powerhouse, a man who'd exposed systemic abuses, won landmark cases, and earned a reputation for fearlessness. The article detailed his latest case, a federal investigation into coastal development projects that displaced marginalized communities, implicating local officials and powerful corporations. This could turn the station upside down. Navarro turned to Bennett and Torres, her voice low and intense, each word a warning. "Do you have any idea who you've arrested?" she said, her eyes boring into theirs. "Diego Morales is a civil rights attorney with a reputation for exposing misconduct. If he files a lawsuit, we're all in trouble." Bennett paled, his bravado crumbling, his hands trembling slightly. "Ma'am, we didn't know," he stammered. "He didn't say." "It doesn't matter," Navarro snapped, cutting him off. "You should have done your due diligence. We need to handle this, and fast." As she spoke, raised voices filtered in from outside, a growing cacophony that sent a chill down her spine. Navarro's heart sank as she realized a crowd was forming, their chants growing louder, demanding justice for Diego. "Great," she muttered under her breath, her mind racing. "Just what we needed." Vega, still hovering nearby, stepped forward, her voice urgent. "Captain, the community's fired up," she said, her eyes darting to the window where the crowd's silhouettes were visible. "Activists, local leaders, and media are showing up. If we don't act soon, this could turn into a crisis." Navarro knew Vega was right. She'd seen small incidents spiral into chaos when mishandled, and this was no small incident. "We need to get ahead of this," she said decisively, her mind already formulating a plan. "Bennett, Torres, prepare a full report on the arrest. Every step, every reason. I don't care how late we're here. Vega, help me figure out how to handle the press. We need to control the narrative." The officers scattered, Bennett and Torres moving to a desk to start their reports, their faces pale, while Vega followed Navarro to her office, pulling up contacts for the station's PR team. Navarro felt the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She was new to Coral Bay, still earning the trust of her officers and the community, and now she was facing a potential disaster. But she was determined to protect the department's integrity, to do what was right, no matter the cost. In the holding cell, Diego remained seated, his mind racing as he listened to the commotion outside. He could hear the crowd growing louder, their voices echoing through the station's walls, a chorus of anger and solidarity. He knew his family would be out there, his mother, his sister, maybe even his cousins, along with community leaders, activists, and friends. They wouldn't let this go unanswered, and that knowledge gave him strength. He thought of Javier's video, the phone capturing every moment of the arrest, and hoped it was already spreading, showing the world what had happened. A sense of hope flickered, but he knew it was too soon to feel relieved. The police still held control, and they could manipulate the situation. He'd seen it before, cases where truth was buried under bureaucracy and lies, and he wouldn't underestimate them. Outside, the crowd swelled to over 100, their signs and banners a vivid display of outrage. Justice for Diego. End police bias. Coral Bay demands accountability. Reporters had arrived, their cameras capturing every moment, the station becoming a flashpoint for growing unrest. A local news van was parked nearby, its antenna raised, while journalists interviewed protesters, their microphones thrust forward to catch every word. A young activist, Lucia Gomez, stood on a makeshift platform, her voice amplified by a megaphone. "Diego Morales is one of us!" she shouted, her words ringing out over the crowd. "He's fought for our rights, for our homes, and now they're trying to silence him. We won't let this stand." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants growing louder, their energy a force that seemed to shake the very walls of the station. Navarro watched from the front window, her jaw clenched, her mind racing. She knew she had to act, but one wrong move could ignite everything, turning a tense situation into a full-blown crisis. "We need to release him," Navarro told Vega, her voice tight with resolve. "It's the only way to de-escalate." Vega nodded, her fingers already typing a draft for the press release. "How do we explain it to the media?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the window where the crowd's signs were visible. "We frame it as a misunderstanding," Navarro replied, her tone firm. "We reviewed the evidence, found no basis for the arrest, and released him. We'll emphasize our commitment to justice and fairness, and we'll promise a full investigation." It wasn't perfect, but it was their best shot at calming the situation. Navarro turned to Bennett and Torres, who were hunched over their reports, their faces pale and drawn. "When this is over, we're having a long conversation about what went wrong," she said coldly, her eyes boring into theirs. "And it won't be pleasant." Bennett swallowed hard, nodding silently, while Torres avoided her gaze, his hands trembling as he typed. They knew they were in deep trouble, their careers hanging by a thread. Navarro returned to Diego's cell, opening the door herself, her boots echoing in the small space. "Mr. Morales, I've reviewed the situation," she said, her voice calm but sincere. "It's clear there was a misunderstanding. You're free to go." Diego stood, his expression guarded, his eyes searching hers for any sign of deceit. "A misunderstanding, Captain?" he said, his voice low but pointed. "Is that what we're calling it?" Navarro met his gaze, unflinching, her respect for him growing. "Yes," she said, her tone steady. "I'm deeply sorry for what happened. It shouldn't have gone this far." Diego studied her for a long moment, weighing her words, her sincerity. Finally, he nodded, a small gesture of acknowledgement. "I appreciate the apology, Captain," he said, his voice measured. "But this isn't over." Navarro didn't doubt it. She could see the fire in his eyes, the resolve that had made him a formidable attorney, a champion for justice. She escorted him out, past officers who avoided his gaze, their heads bowed as if sensing the weight of their mistake. As they reached the front door, Navarro paused, her hand on the handle. "I'll do everything I can to make this right," she said quietly, her voice carrying a promise. Diego nodded, but said nothing, his focus shifting to the crowd outside, their chants a steady drumbeat of support. He stepped through the door, and the crowd erupted in cheers, a wave of sound that seemed to shake the ground. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions, their microphones thrust forward. But Diego walked calmly to his family, who were waiting at the edge of the crowd. His mother, Elena, threw her arms around him, tears streaming down her face, her voice choked with relief. "Mijo, I was so scared," she whispered, clutching him tightly. His sister, Camila, joined the embrace, her eyes blazing with anger and pride. "We've got your back, Diego," she said fiercely. "Always." Diego held them close, his heart swelling with gratitude, the weight of the morning's ordeal easing slightly in their presence. Navarro watched from the station steps, a mix of relief and resolve settling over her. The immediate crisis was averted, but she knew this was just the beginning. Diego Morales wouldn't let this go quietly, and the ripple effects would be felt for a long time. She turned back to the station, her mind already shifting to the next steps: reports, investigations, and the daunting task of rebuilding trust. In her office, Navarro couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Diego's composure, his quiet strength, nagged at her, a reminder that there was more to this story. She sat at her desk, her computer screen glowing, and began searching for more information on Diego Morales. The results were eye-opening, each article painting a picture of a man who was more than just a lawyer. Diego was a civil rights attorney who'd taken on corrupt government agencies, exposed systemic abuses, and won landmark cases that changed lives. His latest case was a federal investigation into coastal development projects that displaced marginalized communities, projects that enriched corporations and local officials while leaving families homeless. The implications were staggering, and Navarro's blood ran cold as she read. She picked up the phone, dialing an FBI contact she'd worked with in the past, a man whose discretion she trusted. "Tom, it's Elena Navarro," she said when he answered. "I need to know about Diego Morales." There was a pause on the other end, a hesitation that spoke volumes. "Elena, you're in deep," Tom said finally, his voice low. "Morales is a federal asset, working undercover to gather evidence for a case that could bring down some big names. His arrest wasn't random. Someone wanted him out of the way." Navarro's heart sank, the pieces falling into place. This wasn't just a case of biased policing. It was a deliberate act, a move to silence a man who threatened powerful interests. "Thanks, Tom," she said, her voice tight. "Keep me posted." She hung up, her mind racing. If Diego was targeted, the station was complicit, knowingly or not, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Navarro called Bennett and Torres into a private room, her expression grim as she closed the door. "Do you realize what you've done?" she demanded, her voice low but intense, each word a blade. "Diego Morales is a federal asset, working on a case that could implicate people far above our pay grade. You've walked into a trap." Bennett's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he struggled to respond. "We didn't know, ma'am," he stammered, his voice barely audible. You thought he was just another Hispanic man you could push around," Navarro snapped, cutting him off. "You've put this department at risk, and I want to know why." Torres, who had been silent, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting to Bennett. "It was just a routine stop," he said weakly. But the words sounded hollow, even to him. Navarro's eyes narrowed, her instincts telling her there was more to this, a thread she needed to pull. Before she could press further, Chief Miguel Salazar stormed into the room, his face flushed with anger, his tie askew from a morning of crisis management. "Navarro, what the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice booming. "I'm getting calls from the mayor, the press, and now the feds." Navarro stood, meeting his gaze with a calm that belied the storm within her. "Chief, we have a problem," she said, her voice steady. "Diego Morales is a civil rights attorney and a federal asset. His arrest wasn't random, it was targeted, and Bennett and Torres are at the center of it." Salazar's eyes widened, his anger giving way to shock. "Targeted," he repeated, his voice dropping. "By who?" Navarro shook her head, her expression grim. "I don't know yet," but we need to find out. Fast." Salazar turned to Bennett and Torres, his expression hardening. "You two are suspended, effective immediately," he said, his voice cold. "And you'd better pray this doesn't end your careers." As Salazar spoke, a knock interrupted them, sharp and insistent. A young officer poked his head in, his face pale. "Chief, Captain, a federal agent is here." Agent Maria Ruiz. The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. Agent Ruiz entered, tall and imposing in a crisp suit, her badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Her dark eyes swept the room, taking in each face with a precision that made Navarro's skin prickle. "Chief Salazar, Captain Navarro," she greeted curtly, her voice clipped. "We need to talk." Salazar squared his shoulders, his face a mask of professionalism despite the turmoil within. "Agent Ruiz, I'm sure we can explain." "No need," Ruiz cut in, her tone sharp. "I'm aware of what happened. Diego Morales is key to a federal investigation into corruption tied to coastal development. His arrest was a mistake, one with serious consequences." Navarro's pulse quickened, her worst fears confirmed. "We understand, Agent Ruiz," she said, her voice steady. "We're prepared to cooperate fully." Ruiz nodded, her expression unyielding. "Good," she said. "You'll provide a formal apology, and any resistance will be met with swift action." As she turned to leave, she paused, her voice dropping to a chilling whisper. "One more thing. The federal government is watching. Any further misconduct will not be tolerated." The station buzzed with tension, the air thick with the weight of what had transpired. News of Diego's arrest spread like wildfire, igniting protests across Coral Bay. Social media was ablaze with Javier's video, the footage shared thousands of times, each view fueling the community's outrage. Salazar, in his office, dialed the PR team, his voice strained. "Draft a public apology," he ordered. "We're addressing the media this afternoon." Navarro approached him, her expression grim. "Chief, before you go out there, you need to know something," she said, handing him a folder. "I've uncovered evidence of systemic corruption, bribery, cover-ups, profiling. It goes beyond Bennett and Torres. It's embedded in the department." Salazar exhaled, his shoulders sagging as he flipped through the pages, his face a mix of anger and resignation. "Then we face the consequences," he said finally, his voice heavy. "We can't hide from this." They walked to the station's front, where a podium had been set up, surrounded by reporters and a sea of protesters, their signs a vivid display of defiance. The crowd fell silent as Salazar stepped up, cameras clicking, microphones thrust forward. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice strained but resolute. "The arrest of Mr. Diego Morales was a mistake, a grave error that should never have happened. I take full responsibility and offer my sincerest apologies to him and the Coral Bay community." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, a mix of skepticism and anger, some shouting questions, others shaking their heads. "This incident is part of a larger problem," Salazar continued, his voice gaining strength. "Effective immediately, Officers Bennett and Torres are suspended, pending a full investigation. We will review our practices and work with federal oversight to ensure accountability and transparency." Diego stepped forward, raising a hand to quiet the crowd, his presence commanding attention. "Chief Salazar, I appreciate the apology," he said, his voice clear and strong. "But this isn't about words, it's about action. Real change, real accountability." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a thunderous wave of support. Diego faced them, his eyes sweeping over the sea of faces, seeing the hope, the anger, the determination. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice resonating with conviction. "It's about everyone wronged by a system meant to protect them. It's about the families displaced by greed, the communities silenced by corruption. We need a system that treats all with fairness, that upholds justice for everyone, not just a few. His words struck a chord, cutting through years of mistrust, igniting a spark of hope. Change takes time, he continued, his tone measured but passionate. But together, we can build a better future, a Coral Bay, where justice is a reality, not a dream. The crowd roared, their applause shaking the air, their signs raised high. Diego paused, letting the moment sink in, feeling the weight of their support, their belief in him. He could see hope in their eyes, a desire for something better, and it filled him with determination. Change doesn't happen overnight, he said, his voice steady. But it starts with us, here, now, together. As the applause swelled, Diego stepped back, his message delivered, his resolve unshaken. The crowd's energy was palpable, a force that would carry them forward, and he knew this was just the beginning. Navarro watched from the station steps, a mix of relief and resolve settling over her. The immediate crisis was averted, but the department had a long road ahead, one paved with hard truths and harder choices. She turned to Salazar, still by the podium, his expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. "We have a lot of work to do," she said quietly. Salazar nodded, his eyes on the crowd, their signs still visible in the fading light. "Yes, we do," he said, "but we'll get through this." As the crowd began to disperse, Navarro noticed a figure lingering at the edge of the gathering, his silhouette sharp against the setting sun. He was tall, dressed in a dark suit, his face partially obscured by a fedora, watching Diego with an intense, almost predatory gaze. Curiosity piqued. Navarro approached, her boots crunching against the gravel. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice firm but cautious. The man turned, his eyes sharp, a faint smile playing on his lips, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to speak with Mr. Morales," he said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I have a message for him." Navarro frowned, studying him, her instincts flaring. "Who are you?" she asked, her hand resting lightly on her belt, a subtle gesture of readiness. The man's smile widened, but it was cold, calculated. "Just someone interested in seeing justice done," he said, his words cryptic, laced with an undercurrent of menace. Before Navarro could respond, he turned and walked toward Diego, disappearing into the thinning crowd. Navarro watched, a sense of unease settling in her chest. Whoever he was, she had a feeling they'd see him again, and it wouldn't be under pleasant circumstances. Across Coral Bay, in a small community center nestled between a library and a park, another meeting was taking place, its atmosphere charged with purpose. Diego sat at a long table, surrounded by community leaders, activists, and legal experts, their faces lit by the soft glow of overhead lights. The room was filled with the hum of conversation, papers strewn across the table, laptops open to draft proposals. They were hammering out the details of the Bay Justice Initiative, a coalition born from the day's events, a response to the injustice Diego had faced and the systemic issues it exposed. Lucia Gomez, the young activist who'd spoken to the crowd, leaned forward, her voice passionate. "We need to focus on youth," she said, her eyes bright with conviction. "Education is the key, teaching kids their rights, giving them the tools to stand up." Dr. Juan Rivera, a professor of sociology at the local college, nodded, adjusting his glasses. "I agree, Lucia. But we also need immediate action for those suffering now. Families displaced by these development projects, people targeted by police bias." Maria Lopez, a local teacher with a quiet strength, added, "We need a legal aid clinic, something accessible, right here in Coral Bay. People can't fight if they don't have resources." Diego listened, taking notes, his pen moving swiftly across a legal pad. He was impressed by their passion, their clarity of vision, and he felt a surge of pride to be among them. "You're all right," he said, his voice calm but firm, drawing their attention. We need a multi-pronged approach: education, legal support, community oversight. We start with a clinic. Get lawyers on the ground helping people like those displaced families. We set up a board to monitor police conduct, hold them accountable. And we build programs to teach our kids, our neighbors, what justice looks like. The room nodded in agreement, their energy coalescing around his words, a shared vision taking shape. They spent hours debating strategies, drafting plans, assigning tasks. As the meeting ended, the group left the community center with a sense of purpose, their steps lighter, their resolve stronger. They had a long road ahead, but they'd taken the first steps, and that was enough for now. Over the next months, Coral Bay saw small but significant changes, each one a testament to the community's resilience. The Bay Justice Initiative took root, its legal aid clinic opening in a modest storefront, staffed by volunteer lawyers and paralegals who worked tirelessly to represent those wronged by the system. The Community Oversight Board held its first meeting, its members drawn from diverse backgrounds: teachers, activists, retirees, students, all united by a commitment to accountability. Educational programs rolled out in schools and community centers, teaching residents their rights, how to navigate encounters with police, and the history of civil rights in Coral Bay. The police department, under Navarro's watchful eye, implemented de-escalation training, revised its use of force policies, and began partnering with community leaders to rebuild trust. Not everything was smooth. Incidents of misconduct persisted. Old habits died hard. But systems were now in place to address them, to ensure accountability where there had once been silence. 6 months later, Diego returned to the Coral Bay Police Station, not as a suspect, but as a partner, invited to speak to a group of new recruits. The training room was bright, its walls lined with posters about community policing, a far cry from the cold holding cell he'd sat in months before. The recruits, a mix of young faces eager to make a difference, sat attentively as Diego took the podium. "My name is Diego Morales," he began, his voice steady, his presence commanding. "I'm here to talk about justice, not just enforcing the law, but treating every person with dignity, with respect." He shared his story, not with anger, but with purpose, detailing the arrest, the fear, the resolve that carried him through. He spoke of the community's response, the changes they'd fought for, and the work still ahead. "You have a choice," he told the recruits, his eyes sweeping over them. "You can be part of the problem, or you can be part of the solution. Choose wisely." A young recruit, Mia Torres, approached him after, her eyes bright with determination. "Thank you, Mr. Morales," she said, her voice earnest. "I joined to make a difference, and you reminded me why I'm here." Diego smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Keep that spirit, Mia," he said. "We need people like you." That evening, at the Bay Justice Initiative office, Maria Lopez burst through the door, her face alight with excitement. "Diego, we did it," she said, holding up a letter. "The curriculum, our civil rights program, it's been approved for all Coral Bay schools." The room erupted in cheers, the small team of volunteers hugging, their laughter filling the space. Diego stood, his smile wide, his heart full. "This is our work," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Together." As he walked home that night, the stars bright above Coral Bay, Diego felt a peace he hadn't known in months. The road was long, with setbacks and challenges ahead, but they were building something real, something lasting. Each step, each small victory, was a testament to their resilience, their belief in a better future. Coral Bay was changing, not just in policies or programs, but in its heart, its soul. And Diego knew, as he walked under the starry sky, that they were building a community where justice was not just a word, but a lived reality, one step at a time. If you enjoyed this story, please share it with others. Your support means the world. Thank you for being part of this journey.